Hey everyone, I'm here to help you relax and drift off tonight. If you enjoy using these videos to fall asleep, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more calming content. Share where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'd love to know. Now settle into a cozy spot, take a deep breath, and let's start unwinding together. Stormvale was a town that lived up to its name. Situated in a secluded valley between jagged mountains, it was a place where the weather was always unpredictable. The townsfolk often said that Stormvale had only two moods, gray and grayer. Rain swept through the streets without warning. Thick fog often blanketed the town for days, and fierce winds howled through the night as though mourning something lost. No one could recall a time when the weather had been steady for more than a day. Yet what truly set Stormvale apart wasn't its gloomy weather. It was the haunting legend tied to it. Long ago, before the weather in Stormvale turned wild, the town was protected by a guardian named Alara Gray, a young woman with an unusual gift. She could control the weather. The people adored her, and they relied on her to ensure calm skies for planting, rain during droughts, and warmth during bitter winters. For years, Alara kept Stormvale safe and prosperous, but as often happens with gifts, envy arose. A neighboring town accused her of witchcraft, demanding that she be handed over to them for trial. Fearing for their safety, the townsfolk betrayed Alara, dragging her to the edge of the valley where she was tied to a tree and left to die in a terrible storm. Before her final breath, Alara uttered a curse. "You took my life, so I will take your peace. The skies of Stormvale will be my prison, and I will make you suffer as I have suffered." With that, she vanished, her body consumed by the storm. From that day on, Stormvale was plagued by erratic weather. Some believed it was simply bad luck, but others whispered that Alara's spirit had become one with the skies, forever haunting the town. Generations passed, and Stormvale grew accustomed to its strange weather. While the older villagers feared Alara's ghost, the younger ones dismissed it as an old tale meant to keep children from wandering too far during storms. One such skeptic was Thomas Hale, a young journalist who had recently moved to Stormvale. Thomas had grown up in the city, where weather was predictable and ghosts existed only in stories told for entertainment. He was fascinated by the town's lore and had come to investigate the strange phenomena for a series of articles. "Ghosts don't control the weather," he told Marion, the local innkeeper, during one of their conversations. "It's probably some unique meteorological pattern caused by the mountains." Marion, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a knowing smile, merely shrugged. "Believe what you want, Thomas, but mark my words, Stormvale's weather has a mind of its own, and that mind belongs to Alara Gray." Late one night, while Thomas was typing up his notes in his small rented room, a sudden chill swept through the air. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows. Then, without warning, the rain began to pour, harder and heavier than he'd ever seen. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the room in brief bursts of blinding light. Thomas went to the window, curious about the sudden storm. As he peered out, something caught his eye, a figure standing in the middle of the street. Clad in a tattered gray cloak, the figure seemed unaffected by the wind and rain swirling around them. "Who in their right mind would be out in this weather?" Thomas muttered, grabbing his coat. He rushed downstairs and out into the storm, determined to help whoever it was. But by the time he reached the street, the figure had vanished. All that remained was the echo of a woman's voice carried on the wind, whispering his name. "Thomas." The next morning, Thomas shared his experience with Marion. "I saw someone last night. I swear I heard them call my name." Marion's expression darkened. "You've caught her attention," she said grimly. "Alara doesn't like outsiders poking around. You'd best leave before things get worse." But Thomas wasn't one to back down. He began interviewing more townsfolk, piecing together the fragments of Alara's story. The more he learned, the more he became convinced that something supernatural was indeed at work. One afternoon, he visited the old oak tree where Alara had supposedly been tied. The tree, twisted and blackened by time, stood alone on a hill overlooking the valley. As Thomas approached, the wind picked up, swirling leaves around him. He placed his hand on the rough bark, and a sudden vision flashed before his eyes. In the vision, he saw Alara, her hands bound, rain pouring down her face as she uttered her curse. Her eyes, filled with sorrow and rage, seemed to lock onto his. Determined to put an end to the haunting, Thomas sought out Marion once more. "There must be a way to break the curse," he said. "What if I can talk to her, convince her to let the town go?" Marion hesitated before handing him a small, weathered locket. "This belonged to Alara," she explained. "Her mother gave it to her before she died. If anything can reach her, it's this." That night, Thomas returned to the hill, locket in hand. The storm raged around him as he called out, "Alara Gray! I know you're here!" The wind howled louder, and the figure in gray appeared once more. Her ghostly form shimmered in the lightning's glow, eyes cold and distant. "You seek to end my curse?" she asked, her voice echoing with the power of the storm. "Yes," Thomas said, holding out the locket. "I understand your pain, but this town doesn't have to suffer anymore. You can find peace." Alara stared at the locket, her expression softening. For a moment, the storm seemed to pause. Then, with a sigh, she reached out and touched the locket. Her form began to fade, and the skies slowly cleared. "Thank you," she whispered before vanishing completely. In the days that followed, the weather in Stormvale became strangely calm. For the first time in generations, the sun shone brightly, and the people rejoiced. Thomas finished his article, but he knew that no words could truly capture what he had experienced. Though Alara was gone, her story lived on, a reminder of how fear and betrayal can leave lasting scars, but also how understanding and courage can bring healing. And while Stormvale's skies remained peaceful, Thomas often wondered if, somewhere in the wind, Alara's spirit still watched over the town she had once loved. The small town of Glenwick was known for its tranquility. Nestled in the heart of a dense forest, it seemed untouched by time. Though many of its buildings had been modernized, a sense of nostalgia lingered in the air. One building in particular stood out. A weathered old radio repair shop called Jensen's Radios, owned by an elderly man named Walter Jensen. Walter had been repairing radios for over 4 decades. His shop was cluttered with old equipment, shelves lined with dusty transistor radios, and wires that hung from the ceiling like vines. Despite the rise of modern technology, some of the older residents still brought in their vintage radios for repairs. Walter loved his work, but recently, something strange had been happening. Voices emanated from radios that weren't even plugged in. One quiet evening, as Walter was closing up, he heard a faint crackling sound. He turned toward an old tabletop radio sitting on his workbench. It was an antique, something he had been fixing for a collector. But what made him freeze was that the radio wasn't connected to any power source. Suddenly, through the static, a whisper emerged. "Help! Me!" Walter blinked, unsure if he had imagined it. He approached the radio cautiously, adjusting the dials. The whisper grew clearer. "Please, hear me. I'm trapped." Heart pounding, Walter grabbed the radio and inspected it thoroughly. There was no logical explanation for what he was hearing. He turned it off, but even then, the voice continued to echo faintly. Uneasy, he locked the shop and went home. But sleep didn't come easily that night. The next morning, Walter decided to keep the strange incident to himself. He rationalized that perhaps it had been interference from a nearby signal or his mind playing tricks on him. However, things only grew stranger. Over the next few days, more radios began emitting whispers, different voices, each pleading for help or uttering cryptic phrases. Curious and a little frightened, Walter decided to record the voices. He set up a tape recorder near one of the radios and waited. At first, there was only static. Then after several minutes, a voice crackled through, "Find us, beneath the ground. Find the forgotten." The message sent a chill down his spine. What did it mean? Who or what was speaking through the radios? Walter wasn't the only one who had noticed strange occurrences. Some of the townsfolk began to report similar experiences with their own radios. A young couple claimed they had heard a woman sobbing through their old radio late at night, while an elderly man swore he had heard his late wife's voice calling his name. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Walter sought the help of Emily Carter, a local historian who specialized in Glenwick's past. Emily was skeptical at first, but when Walter played the recordings for her, she grew serious. "There's a legend about Glenwick," Emily said, flipping through an old book. "Nearly a century ago, there was a terrible accident at the town's old mine. Dozens of workers were trapped underground after a cave-in. Rescue efforts failed, and the mine was sealed off. No one ever recovered the bodies. Walter's eyes widened. You think the voices are from the miners? Emily nodded. It's possible. The mine is only a few miles from here. Maybe something is connecting their spirits to the radios. Something unfinished. With Emily's help, Walter gathered a small group of townsfolk who had experienced the strange radio phenomena. They decided to visit the abandoned mine. It was a cold, foggy morning when they arrived at the site. The entrance to the mine was boarded up, but a faint hum seemed to emanate from within, almost like distant static. As they stood there, one of the old radios Walter had brought with him crackled to life. A voice, clearer than ever before, spoke. Free us, bring light to the darkness. Understanding the message, Walter retrieved a powerful lantern from his bag. He shone its beam through a crack in the boards covering the entrance. Suddenly, the air grew still, and a faint glow appeared deep within the mine. One by one, ghostly figures emerged, miners in old-fashioned clothing, their faces pale and expressionless. They hovered silently for a moment before slowly fading into the light. The static stopped, and the air grew warmer. After that day, the strange occurrences in Glenwick ceased. Radios no longer whispered eerie messages, and the townsfolk felt a sense of relief. Walter continued running his shop, but he kept one of the old radios as a reminder of the experience. Emily documented the event, calling it the Whispering Spirits of Glenwick. Though many dismissed it as a tale born from collective imagination, those who had heard the voices knew the truth. Walter never heard the ghostly whispers again, but sometimes late at night, he would sit in his shop, turn on the old radio, and listen to the comforting sound of silence, grateful that he had been able to bring peace to those long-forgotten souls. And though the voices were gone, he always kept the lantern close, just in case the spirits ever needed help again. There was a story whispered among the townsfolk of Ravendale, a story that stretched back generations. It was a tale so chilling that even the bravest of men would hesitate before speaking of it too loudly. It told of a mysterious carnival that appeared only once in a great while, on the night of a blood moon. Those who entered the carnival never returned the same, and some never returned at all. Most dismissed it as an old legend meant to keep curious children from wandering too far at night. But for those who had seen the crimson glow on the horizon during a blood moon, it was more than just a story. It was a warning. According to the legend, the Blood Moon Carnival had first appeared centuries ago when a group of traveling performers arrived in Ravendale. Led by a charismatic ringmaster named Lucian Blackthorne, the carnival was unlike anything the townsfolk had ever seen. There were acrobats who seemed to defy gravity, clowns who could twist their bodies into impossible shapes, and a fortune teller who claimed to see not just the future, but the souls of the dead. For 3 nights, the carnival dazzled and delighted the town. But on the 4th night, something terrible happened. A blood moon rose in the sky, casting an eerie red glow over the carnival. Witnesses said they heard strange music drifting through the air, a haunting melody that sent chills down their spines. By morning, the entire carnival had vanished without a trace. The only thing left behind was a scarred patch of earth where the main tent had stood. Over time, strange disappearances began to occur whenever a blood moon rose. Those brave, or foolish, enough to wander out at night during the crimson glow sometimes spoke of hearing distant carnival music, faint laughter, and the scent of roasted peanuts carried on the wind. Then they would vanish. One fateful autumn, after years without incident, the town of Ravendale once again prepared for the blood moon. This time it was different. The air felt heavier, the nights grew colder, and a sense of dread settled over the town. Among the townsfolk was a young woman named Clara Hastings. She had grown up hearing the stories of the Blood Moon Carnival from her grandmother, who claimed to have seen it as a child. Unlike most, Clara didn't dismiss the tales. She believed them. And when the blood moon began to rise that night, she decided to find out the truth for herself. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and her courage, Clara made her way to the outskirts of town, where the stories claimed the carnival appeared. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. As she walked, a faint melody began to drift through the air, A haunting tune played on what sounded like a distant calliope. Clara's heart raced. The music grew louder, and soon the scent of cotton candy and popcorn filled the air. Through the trees she saw it, a sprawling carnival illuminated by flickering lanterns, its tents and rides glowing under the blood-red moon. Despite the fear gnawing at her insides, Clara stepped forward. The entrance to the carnival was marked by a massive archway adorned with faded banners and flickering lights. Above it, in ornate letters, was the name Blood Moon Carnival. She hesitated for a moment before stepping through the archway. Instantly, the air around her changed. It was colder, and the sounds of laughter and music seemed to echo from all directions. The carnival was bustling with life, or at least something that resembled life. Strange figures moved among the attractions, clowns with hollow eyes, acrobats whose movements seemed unnaturally fluid, and vendors who offered sweets that smelled both delicious and wrong. Clara felt a shiver run down her spine. She noticed something else, too. None of the figures cast shadows. "Welcome, traveler," a voice boomed. Clara turned to see a tall, thin man dressed in an old-fashioned ringmaster's suit. His face was pale, and his eyes gleamed with an unsettling light. "I am Lucian Blackthorn, Master of Ceremonies. You've come just in time for the greatest show on Earth." Lucian led Clara toward the main tent, where a crowd of shadowy figures had gathered. As she entered, the scent of incense and old wood filled her nostrils. The tent was larger on the inside, with a grand stage at its center. Lucian clapped his hands and the lights dimmed. One by one, the performers took the stage, each act more bizarre and horrifying than the last. Acrobats twisted their bodies into grotesque shapes. Contortionists folded themselves into impossible forms. And the clowns. Their laughter was hollow, echoing through the tent like a chorus of lost souls. Clara's fear grew with each passing moment, but she knew she couldn't leave. Not yet. She needed to understand what this place was and how to stop it. As the final act ended, Lucian approached her once more. "You've seen the wonders of our carnival. Now you must stay forever." Clara backed away, her heart pounding. She had to find a way out. As Lucian raised his hand, preparing to trap her, she remembered something her grandmother had said. "The carnival thrives on fear. Without it, they have no power." Summoning every ounce of courage, Clara took a deep breath and shouted, "You don't scare me!" For a moment, everything froze. The performers stopped moving, the music ceased, and Lucian's smile faltered. The red glow of the blood moon dimmed, and the carnival began to flicker like a fading illusion. "No!" Lucian roared. "You cannot leave!" But it was too late. Clara turned and ran toward the entrance. As she crossed the archway, the carnival behind her vanished into thin air, leaving only an empty field under the fading glow of the blood moon. Clara returned to Ravendale, shaken but alive. She tried to tell the townsfolk what she had seen, but most didn't believe her. Only a few, those who had lost loved ones to the blood moon, listened with wide eyes and fearful hearts. Though the carnival was gone, Clara knew it wasn't forever. One day when the blood moon rose again, so too would the blood moon carnival. But now she knew its secret, and she vowed to be ready when it returned. For in Ravendale, the legend was no mere tale. It was a curse waiting for its next victim. And as long as the blood moon rose, the carnival would always come back. In the quiet town of Brimstone Hollow, there was an unspoken fear, a fear that settled in the hearts of the townsfolk when they lay down to sleep. Over the years, the town had gained a dark reputation for strange happenings. People who once lived normal lives suddenly became consumed by paranoia, madness, or worse, disappeared altogether. No one knew the exact cause, but whispers in the night told of something sinister, something that lived not in the waking world, but in the realm of dreams. The elders of Brimstone Hollow called it the Nightmare Weaver, an ancient spirit that preyed on those who dared to dream too deeply. It didn't simply haunt its victims. It twisted their minds, using their own fears and desires against them until they could no longer distinguish between dream and reality. It began with Eleanor Finch, a young school teacher who had recently moved to Brimstone Hollow. She was well liked by the children and admired by the other townsfolk for her kindness and gentle demeanor. But everything changed one fateful night when Eleanor began to experience vivid, unsettling dreams. At first, the dreams were harmless. Memories of her childhood home, her parents, and quiet days spent reading under the old oak tree in her backyard. But as the nights wore on, the dreams grew darker. The familiar places were replaced by shadowy landscapes, and strange figures began to appear. Figures with no faces but piercing eyes that seemed to watch her every move. Eleanor confided in her friend Margaret, the town's apothecary, hoping for an explanation. Margaret, an old soul well-versed in local lore, listened intently before whispering, "The Nightmare Weaver has found you." Eleanor scoffed at the idea. She didn't believe in spirits or old legends, but deep down, a gnawing sense of dread took root. That night, when she lay down to sleep, she found herself in a dream unlike any other. She stood in a vast, empty field under a sky that pulsed with an eerie, crimson light. The ground beneath her feet was cold and damp, and the air carried a metallic tang like blood. A voice, soft yet chilling, whispered from the shadows, "You cannot escape me, Eleanor. I know your fears. I know your heart." Over the following days, Eleanor's condition worsened. She became withdrawn, her once bright eyes hollow and haunted. At night, she tossed and turned, plagued by dreams where the voice grew louder, taunting her with visions of her worst fears. Being alone, forgotten, and powerless. Margaret, desperate to help her friend, sought out Father Alaric, the town's reclusive priest. Alaric had spent years studying ancient texts and rituals, and he had long suspected that the Nightmare Weaver was more than a myth. "The Nightmare Weaver feeds on fear," Alaric explained. "It enters through dreams and plants seeds of doubt and terror. The more the victim fears, the stronger it becomes, until it can control their very thoughts, even in the waking world." "But how can we stop it?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. "There is a ritual," Alaric said, "one that can sever its connection to Eleanor. But it is dangerous. The Weaver will not let her go easily." That night, Margaret and Alaric gathered in Eleanor's home. The room was dimly lit by flickering candles, and the air was thick with the scent of burning sage. Eleanor lay on the bed, her face pale and drenched in sweat. "Are you ready?" Alaric asked Margaret. She nodded, though fear gripped her heart. Alaric began the ritual, chanting words in a language long forgotten. As the chant grew louder, the air in the room grew colder, and the shadows on the walls seemed to twist and writhe. Suddenly, Eleanor's eyes snapped open, but they were not her own. Black as midnight, with a gleam of malevolent intelligence. "You dare to challenge me?" The voice of the Nightmare Weaver hissed through Eleanor's lips. "You cannot banish what you cannot see." Ignoring the taunts, Alaric continued the ritual. Margaret placed her hand on Eleanor's forehead, whispering words of comfort. Slowly, the dark presence began to weaken, its grip on Eleanor loosening. But just as they thought they were succeeding, the spirit lashed out, sending a wave of cold energy through the room. Margaret was thrown back, and the candles flickered dangerously. "You cannot win," the Weaver snarled. Summoning all his strength, Alaric uttered the final words of the ritual. A blinding light filled the room, and with a deafening scream, the Nightmare Weaver was cast out. Eleanor gasped, her body trembling as the dark presence left her. The morning dawned bright and clear, and for the first time in weeks, Eleanor felt at peace. Though weak, she knew she had been freed from the spirit's grasp. Margaret and Alaric watched over her, relieved that their efforts had succeeded. But Alaric remained wary. The Nightmare Weaver has been driven away, but it is not gone forever. It lurks in the shadows, waiting for another victim. We must be vigilant. Over time, Eleanor regained her strength and resumed her life. But the town of Brimstone Hollow would never forget the terror of the Nightmare Weaver. Though it had been banished, the spirit's influence lingered, a reminder of the darkness that could creep into even the safest of places. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispered through the trees and the moon cast long shadows over the town, some swore they could still hear the faint echoes of a voice in the distance. A voice that whispered from the realm of dreams, waiting for its next victim. For in Brimstone Hollow, no one ever truly sleeps without fear. Tucked away in the forgotten corners of a remote countryside was a road known only to the locals as Holleridge Path. No map marked its existence, and those who traveled it often did so by accident or misfortune. The road was narrow, flanked by towering oaks whose gnarled branches reached out like skeletal fingers. A permanent mist hung low, masking the path in a shroud of eerie stillness. Few who took the road dared to speak of their experience afterward, and those who did shared only one terrifying truth. They had encountered versions of themselves, ghostly, hollow-eyed echoes of their past lives. Legends about Holleridge Path had circulated for centuries. Some said it was cursed by a traveler who had been wrong long ago, while others believed it was a tear in the fabric of time, a liminal space where past, present, and future blurred. Despite the warnings, the road continued to lure the curious, the lost, and the desperate. It was a cold autumn evening when Ethan Miller, a young journalist, first heard about Holleridge Path. He was visiting a nearby village to write a feature on local folklore. The villagers were friendly enough, but when he mentioned the cursed road, their expressions turned grim. "You don't want to go down that road, lad," warned old Tom, the innkeeper. "Folks who walk it come back different, if they come back at all." Ethan, intrigued by the ominous tales, pressed for more details, but the villagers refused to say much. All he gathered was that Holleridge Path appeared only under certain conditions, at dusk, when the fog was thick, and when the traveler was alone. Determined to uncover the truth, Ethan decided to investigate. He packed a flashlight, a notebook, and a camera before setting off the next evening. The sky was overcast, casting a dull gray hue over the landscape. He found the entrance to the road easily. It seemed almost as if the path had been waiting for him. As Ethan walked down the path, a chilling silence enveloped him. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath his feet. The mist thickened with every step, and soon he could barely see a few feet ahead. He glanced at his watch. It was 7:45 p.m. Dusk had fallen, and the air felt unnaturally cold. After what felt like an hour of walking, Ethan noticed something peculiar ahead. A faint figure standing in the middle of the road. His heart pounded as he drew closer, and his breath caught in his throat when he realized the figure looked exactly like him. The other Ethan was younger, perhaps by 5 years. He wore the same worn leather jacket Ethan had discarded long ago and held a battered notebook identical to the one Ethan had kept during his early years as a journalist. The younger version of himself stared back with a mix of confusion and fear. "Who are you?" the younger Ethan asked, his voice trembling. "I'm you," Ethan replied, though the words felt absurd even as he said them. "Or rather, I'm who you become." The younger Ethan took a step back, clutching the notebook tightly. "This can't be real," he whispered. "I must be dreaming." Ethan realized that Holleridge Path wasn't just cursed. It forced travelers to confront their past selves, to reckon with the choices they had made. He remembered the younger version of himself well, idealistic, full of hope, and burdened by a need to prove himself. Back then, Ethan had been driven by ambition, but had also been plagued by self-doubt. "You didn't think you'd make it, did you?" Ethan asked, his voice softer now. The younger Ethan's eyes widened. "How do you know that?" "Because I was you. I remember those late nights wondering if you'd ever be good enough, wondering if anyone would care about what you wrote." The younger Ethan looked down at his notebook, his expression pained. "I gave up on some of those dreams," he admitted. "I thought I wasn't strong enough. And yet here you are," Ethan said, "still standing, still fighting. You made it through those doubts. You became something more." The mist around them thickened once more, and Ethan realized that time on the cursed road was fleeting. He needed to leave before he lost himself in the fog. But before he could turn away, the younger Ethan spoke again. "Thank you," he said, "for reminding me why I started this journey." As Ethan continued down the road, he encountered other versions of himself. The reckless teenager who had taken unnecessary risks, the heartbroken young man who had lost his first love, and even a future version of himself, older, grizzled, and weary, with eyes that carried the weight of many more years. Each encounter forced Ethan to confront emotions he had long buried: regret, sorrow, and fear. But by the end of the path, he felt a strange sense of closure. The road had shown him not only who he had been, but also who he could become. When he finally emerged from Holleridge Path, the mist lifted, and the night sky stretched clear above him. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling lighter than he had in years. He looked at his watch. It was 8:30 p.m. Though it felt like hours had passed, he had only been gone for 45 minutes. Ethan returned to the village the next day, his mind racing with thoughts. He knew he had found something extraordinary, but he also understood why the villagers were so afraid of the road. Holleridge Path didn't just lead travelers astray, it forced them to face the parts of themselves they would rather forget. He decided not to write the article. Some stories, he realized, were meant to remain untold. Instead, he kept the experience to himself, a personal reminder of the journey he had taken, not just down a cursed road, but through his own past. Years later, when Ethan found himself struggling once more, he remembered Holleridge Path and the versions of himself he had met. And in those memories, he found the strength to keep moving forward, knowing that no matter how dark the road ahead seemed, he had already walked through the fog and survived. Thus, the legend of Holleridge Path lived on, whispered among the villagers and feared by those who dared to dream too deeply of who they had been. And though many avoided the cursed road, some, like Ethan, found in it a strange and haunting kind of salvation. Nestled at the end of an old cobblestone street in the heart of a forgotten town stood Page and Prose, a small, weathered bookstore with a faded wooden sign that creaked softly in the wind. Though it appeared unremarkable from the outside, the townspeople knew better. Few dared to venture inside, and those who did rarely spoke of what they had seen. The whispers around town were always the same. Something strange happened in that bookstore, something that no one could explain. Despite the warnings, it had become the perfect place for Clara Bennett to lose herself. An aspiring author and lover of all things literary, Clara had recently moved to the town, seeking inspiration and a quiet place to write. When she stumbled upon Page and Prose, she was immediately drawn to it. The first time she entered, the air inside smelled of aged paper and ink, with a hint of something metallic, almost like the scent of a summer storm. The shelves towered high, packed with leather-bound tomes, yellowed paperbacks, and strange books with no titles on their spines. The shop was eerily silent, save for the faint rustle of pages, though there was no one else in sight. Behind the counter stood an old man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. He wore a neatly pressed suit and had an air of mystery about him. When Clara approached, he gave her a polite nod, but said nothing. "Hello," Clara said, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet shop. "This place is amazing. Are you the owner?" The old man smiled faintly. "I am," he said. His voice was calm, almost too calm, as though it belonged to someone who had spent a lifetime speaking in whispers. "Welcome to Page and Prose. If you're looking for something special, you might just find it here." Clara smiled back, though his words unsettled her. She began browsing the shelves, running her fingers over the spines of the books. Many of them seemed ancient, with covers that were cracked and worn. Some had strange symbols etched into their leather bindings, while others appeared so new they looked as if they had just been printed. Clara pulled out a book titled Legends of the Forgotten Sea. As she opened it, a cold draft swept through the store, causing the candles on the counter to flicker. She barely noticed, too engrossed in the vivid illustrations of ghostly ships and monstrous sea creatures. But then something extraordinary happened. As she read a passage about a fearsome pirate captain known as Elias Blackthorne, she heard a sound behind her, a low, rhythmic tapping, like the echo of footsteps on wood. Turning around, she saw nothing. Yet the tapping grew louder, accompanied by the faint creak of a ship's deck. Before her eyes, a shimmering figure began to materialize. A tall man in a long coat, with a tricorn hat and a cutlass at his side. His eyes were hollow and his presence sent a chill through the air. "Who summons Captain Blackthorne from his eternal slumber?" the figure demanded, his voice like the roar of distant waves. Clara stumbled back, dropping the book. The moment it hit the floor, the figure vanished, leaving only a lingering coldness in the air. Heart pounding, she looked around, half expecting someone to laugh and tell her it was a prank. But the store remained as silent as ever, and the old man behind the counter merely gave her a knowing smile. "You found one of our more lively volumes," he said. "Be careful what you read here. Not all stories are content to stay on the page." Despite the terrifying experience, Clara was hooked. She began visiting the bookstore daily, each time drawn to different books that seemed to call out to her. Some stories brought forth harmless characters, playful animals, mischievous fairies, and kind-hearted heroes. Others unleashed darker presences, shadowy figures that lingered at the edges of her vision, whispering secrets she couldn't quite understand. One day she stumbled upon a peculiar book with no title and no author. Its cover was plain black, and the pages were blank. Curious, she asked the owner about it. "Ah, that one," he said with a cryptic smile. "It's a special kind of book. It writes itself as you read." Intrigued, Clara opened the book. To her astonishment, words began to appear on the pages, telling a story about a young woman who entered a haunted bookstore. As she read further, she realized with growing dread that the story was about her. Every detail, from her arrival in the town to her first encounter with Captain Blackthorn. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "It's your story," the old man said simply. Page and Prose isn't just a bookstore. It's a place where stories come to life, literally. And once a story begins here, it must be finished. As the days passed, Clara found herself unable to stay away from the bookstore. She tried writing her own story, hoping to take control of the strange magic that seemed to bind her. But every time she tried, the words would vanish from the page, as though the bookstore refused to let her end the tale. Characters from forgotten stories began to haunt her apartment. Shadowy figures that whispered in her ear at night. Ghostly animals that prowled her living room. The line between fiction and reality blurred, and Clara realized with growing horror that she was becoming part of the bookstore's collection. Desperate, she confronted the old man. "How do I end this? How do I escape?" He looked at her with a mix of pity and amusement. "There's only one way, my dear. You must write the ending. But be warned, once you finish your story, you may never be the same again." Determined to break free, Clara returned home and began writing. She wrote about her experiences in the bookstore, about the characters that had come to life, and about the old man who seemed to control it all. As she wrote, the words glowed on the page, as if imbued with the same magic that haunted the store. When she reached the final chapter, she hesitated. How should the story end? Should she destroy the bookstore, banishing its magic forever? Or should she become its new guardian, taking the old man's place? In the end, she chose a third option. She wrote herself walking away from the bookstore, free from its grasp, but leaving the door open for those who sought the magic of stories. As she wrote the final sentence, a blinding light filled the room, and she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The next day, when she returned to the street, Page and Prose was gone. In its place was an empty lot, as though the bookstore had never existed. But Clara knew better. Somewhere in some forgotten corner of the world, the haunted bookstore still waited, ready to lure in another storyteller. And she finally finished her first novel, a tale about a haunted bookstore where stories came to life. It became a bestseller, though no one ever truly believed it was real. But Clara knew the truth. Some stories aren't meant to stay on the page. They live, waiting for the next reader brave enough to turn the first chapter. In the quiet village of Willow's Hollow, nestled between dark forests and rolling hills, strange tales had always circulated, whispers of a ghost that meant well, but brought disaster wherever it went. For years, villagers spoke of small, inexplicable events. A cart tipping over just after a strange chill swept through the air, candles being snuffed out before a fire spread, or children inexplicably being found near the edge of the forest after wandering off. Everyone knew of the spirit, though few had ever seen it. They called it Mira, after a young woman who had died tragically a century ago. According to legend, Mira had been kind-hearted in life, always eager to help those in need. But fate had been cruel, and one fateful night, she had perished in a house fire while trying to rescue a neighbor's child. Though the child had survived, Mira had not. It was said that her spirit lingered because of her unfulfilled desire to protect others. However, in her spectral form, her attempts to help often resulted in calamity. No one knew whether it was a curse or simply the tragic irony of her existence. But the villagers had learned to fear Mira's presence. One autumn evening, a traveler named Elias Gray arrived in Willow's Hollow. Elias was a scholar of the supernatural, fascinated by tales of ghosts and spirits. He had spent years studying hauntings, and when he heard of the village's legend, he knew he had to investigate. The villagers were wary of Elias at first. They warned him about Mira, urging him to leave before he attracted the spirit's attention. But Elias was determined. He believed that ghosts were not inherently malevolent, that perhaps Mira could be helped and her tragic cycle of harm could be broken. He rented a small, creaky cottage near the edge of the village and set up his equipment. Old journals filled with notes, delicate instruments designed to detect changes in the air, and a lantern that flickered unnaturally whenever spirits were near. It wasn't long before Elias experienced Mira's presence firsthand. Late one night, as he sat by the fire reviewing his notes, the temperature in the room plummeted. His breath turned to mist, and the lantern flickered violently. He glanced around, heart pounding, as a faint glow appeared in the corner of the room. The glow grew brighter, forming the outline of a young woman with sorrowful eyes and a translucent figure. Her form flickered, as if struggling to maintain coherence. She raised a ghostly hand, pointing toward the fireplace. Instinctively, Elias turned just in time to see a stray ember land on the rug, beginning to smolder. He quickly stamped it out, his mind racing. Mira had saved him from a potential fire. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice steady despite the fear tingling in his spine. The ghost tilted her head, as if confused by his gratitude. Then, before he could say more, she vanished, leaving behind only the faintest trace of cold air. Over the following days, Elias observed more of Mira's interventions. Each time she appeared when danger was near, a toppled lantern that could have caused a blaze, a crumbling beam in an abandoned barn, a loose cart careening down a hill. Yet every attempt to help seemed to end poorly. While she had saved Elias from the ember, her sudden presence had startled a villager passing by the cottage, causing him to trip and twist his ankle. In another instance, Mira had tried to warn a farmer of a broken fence. The farmer, startled by her ghostly form, had fled in terror, leaving his livestock to scatter. It became clear to Elias that Mira's intentions were good, but her presence, cold, unsettling, and sudden, caused more harm than good. She was trapped in a cruel paradox, unable to stop trying to help, yet doomed to cause chaos each time she did. Determined to help Mira find peace, Elias delved deeper into the village's history. He visited the old church, where dusty records told the story of Mira's life and tragic death. He learned that Mira had been deeply loved by the villagers in her time, known for her selflessness and bravery. But there was one entry that caught his eye, a note written by the village priest shortly after Mira's death. She died with regret in her heart. She believed she failed to save the child, though the boy lived. Perhaps her soul lingers because she never knew her efforts were not in vain. Elias realized that Mira's spirit was bound by the weight of her perceived failure. She didn't know that her sacrifice had saved a life. If he could find a way to show her the truth, perhaps she could finally move on. Elias gathered the villagers and explained his plan. Though skeptical, they agreed to help. Together, they reconstructed the old house where Mira had died, creating a space reminiscent of her time. They placed an old portrait of the boy she had saved, now long deceased, above the hearth. That night, Elias lit the lantern and waited. As the hour grew late, Mira appeared once more, her figure flickering as before. This time, Elias spoke to her gently. "Mira, you didn't fail. The child lived because of you. Your sacrifice was not in vain." He gestured toward the portrait. Mira's gaze followed his hand, her ghostly eyes widening as she took in the image of the boy she had saved. A soft light began to emanate from her form, growing brighter and warmer. For the first time, Mira's expression softened into one of peace. Slowly, she began to fade, her outline dissolving into shimmering light. As she vanished, the coldness in the room lifted, replaced by a gentle warmth. The next morning, the villagers awoke to find the air in Willow's Hollow lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. The sense of unease that had hung over the village for years was gone. Mira's spirit had finally found peace. Elias stayed in the village for a time, writing about his experiences and sharing the story of Mira, the misguided spirit who only ever wanted to help. His tale spread far and wide, inspiring others to see spirits not as threats, but as lost souls in need of understanding. And so the legend of Mira the ghost became one not of fear, but of hope, a reminder that even in death, kindness endures, and that sometimes all it takes to break a curse is a little compassion.